into the story, so that their caste had a prominent role to play. That they would rather rewrite history than renounce their caste says something about the importance and the significance of caste to Indians' sense of identity. And caste has in some ways in India become a political asset. Members of low caste can find themselves reaping the benefit of government quotas and political parties that recognize the strength of their numbers. In the recent statewide elections in Uttar Pradesh, the Bahu Samaj Party, or BSP, a party dominated by Dalits or untouchables, swept away the other parties and received enough seats to form a government. What was remarkable about the election was the competing strategies of the BSP and their main opposition, the BJP. While the BJP focused on capturing two blocks of untouchable voters, the BSP succeeded in wooing Muslim voters from their support of the incumbent party. In this election, casteism and classism trumped communalism at the ballot box. In national politics, however, communalism is still a powerful force. The right-wing coalition led by the BJP is resurgent in some states and still threatens to take the center in New Delhi by playing on anti-Muslim and pan-Hindu pride. The Congress, guided by its Gandhian vision of secularism and accommodation for minorities, seems, despite its 2004 victory, to be increasingly out of touch with the direction of political development in India on the state level. In today's political environment, the Congress Party makes its future prospects dimmer by dragging their feet on important issues such as judicial reform. In India today, without getting into too many details, there's not a uniform civil court for all Indian citizens. It's based on a person's religion. And so there are Muslim civil courts and Hindu civil courts. And the way, without getting into details, the way this often works out is that if a Hindu wants, say, a divorce, well, it can take him many, many years for it to get through the courts in some places. If a Muslim wants a divorce and uses the Muslim courts, it can happen very quickly. These communal civil courts have a divisive effect on Hindus and Muslims, as most non-Muslims consider it a bestowal of peculiar rights on one community at the expense of another. Some of the complaints that the Hindu right has about 60 or so years of mainly Congress or Congress-dominated government seem to make sense. Some writers make the mistake, as Martha Craven Nussbaum does in her recent book, The Clash Within: Democracy, Religious Violence, and India's Future, of characterizing the Hindu right as fascist. Nussbaum sees the BJP as a party inspired primarily by Nazism, led by fast-talking ideologues and menacing democracy itself. Quote, democracy has been under siege from religious extremism in another part of the world, end quote, Nussbaum's book proclaims. Quote, the forces of the Hindu right pose a disturbing threat to its democratic traditions and secular state, end quote. It makes for dramatic reading, this idea that fanatical Hindus are trying to turn India into a theocracy. But the central claims of the book are hard to take seriously, especially when you consider that the most dire threat to the institution of democracy itself in India over the last 50 years was perpetrated not by the Hindu right, but by the Gandhi family, I mean Indira and Sanjay, during the emergency of the 1970s. The mainstream Hindu right is not some sort of second incarnation of National Socialism or some sort of Hindu Taliban. And it does not need to be feared as a threat to democracy itself. Rather, if we accept the reality and inevitability of caste-based and communal-based politics on the state level, then the BJP and its allies are nothing more than a national expression of the clannish nature of local governance. Inspired, if not always faithful, to traditional Hinduism, the Hindu right has several millennia of pluralist tradition to draw on. India has historically been tolerant of different religions and worldviews, to an extent that in Europe often was not. As Nobel Prize-winning economist and Nussbaum's own patron Amartya Sen remarked in The Economist in late 2005, quote, India has been fortunate in having a long and powerful argumentative tradition, end quote, which he sees as one of the cornerstones of successful representative government. The Hindu right thus does not fear democracy, dissent, or pluralism. Rather, it is ideologically predisposed to accept these things within certain parameters. This is not to excuse the excesses of Hindu extremists or to make an apology for BJP ministers such as Gujarat's Narendra Modi, the man who made the 2002 Gujarat riots possible, or to excuse those who would turn politics into a street brawl. But we must accept that Indian democracy is not and will not be similar to American or European democracy. And we do not need to make qualitative judgments about its development. When you think about it, a democratic system based on caste and community is no more or less genuinely democratic than our own, where elections of candidates depends as much on sound bites, media manipulation, and shifting primary schedules as on issues. Moreover, the Hindu right-wing and regional caste-based parties represent a dynamic stream of cultural and intellectual development that attempts to adapt and reinterpret social realities to modern times. They are in no sense simple reactionaries, and in some instances their animosity towards certain aspects of Western culture seem to make sense in context. The first time I visited India was in the early 1990s when I was a student. And when I first went to India and you turned on the television, there were only 2 or 3 channels. There wasn't much on TV. And what was on was produced in India. The faces were Indian. People were wearing Indian clothing. And as often as not, what you saw were religious dramas, reenactments of religious stories. 4 years later, in the mid-90s, I went back to India as a grad student. And in the interim, starting with Star TV, Rupert Murdoch's Star TV, which began beaming in programming out of Hong Kong, and followed soon thereafter by other television channels like HBO and MTV. All of a sudden, in a very short period of time, in a matter of just 2, 3, 4 years, I'm not sure exactly, a whole wide range of Western programming was suddenly available to Indians on television. And it had an immediate effect on the behavior of people. When I first visited Benares in Uttar Pradesh and went to the university there, almost everyone, the young men and women, were wearing traditional dress, kurta and pajama and this type of thing. 4 years later, this had changed. And not only were men wearing shirts and pants, Western dress, but in fact, young people were doing things like, piercing their tongue and growing their hair out and doing all sorts of things that mystified their parents. And that it happened in such a short period of time naturally created a backlash. When considering India's development, we often make the assumption of haste. We want things to happen quickly. Sure, bettering their lot is the goal of every Indian, a Hindu or not. But given their belief in the recurrence of life, Hindus are famously or perhaps infamously in no hurry. The law of karma is inviolate. Justice in the Hindu view of life can take thousands of years, but it is inevitable. And this tendency to take the long view makes some skeptical about the latest development schemes. When I was in Uttar Pradesh, I did a story on the scavenger caste. Scavengers are responsible for sanitation oftentimes. And they're also responsible for cleaning sewerage pipes. And they get government contracted work to clean the sewerage pipes. When I was there was development workers had come in and they had claimed that they were going to rebuild Lucknow sewerage system. The group of scavengers that I knew hadn't heard this news, so I told them, did you realize they're building a new sewerage system? And if they do, you'll no longer have any work. They smiled politely, they said thank you, but they didn't seem concerned. They were not worried. They had seen a lot of development schemes come and go. And they all had failed to replace them. They saw it as just another temporary headache, one that they and their jobs would outlast. And to this day, as far as I'm aware, the construction of this so-called new sewerage system still hasn't occurred, or even begun. This propensity to wait, this lack of hurry, contains a certain wisdom. India is an ancient country. It is